where everybody got to
Sorry, we will be recording today for anyone who's wondering.
Welcome everybody. So Kyle did this beautiful thing last week where everybody got to introduce themselves and introduce their project, and I loved hearing about that. And also, I have a ton of material to get through today. So please, if you would like to introduce yourself in the chat, mention a little bit about your project, pronouns, what land or territory you are on, that would be beautiful and wonderful. But I want to make sure that we have tons and tons of time for questions, because I know that the budget portion can be really stressful for folks. And so my goal is to get through all of my slides, make sure that you have ample time to look at all the materials, and then we can hear more about everybody's context from there. Lisa, do you want to do a quick intro?
Yeah. For those, I mean, you probably all know me. Okay, so I'm Lisa Berger. I'm with Independent Arts and Media. I'm most of your fiscal sponsor. Yeah, I'm just gonna, since I know Jericha's got a lot she wants to cover, I'm not gonna go into too much detail. I am just gonna put in a little reminder though, that once you decide which grants you're applying to for CAC, you need to email me because you need a specific letter of support that is not your fiscal sponsorship contract. It's a specific letter that I have to write and we both have to sign. So once you know which categories you're applying, and you need a different one for every category you're applying to. So send me that list and I'll be turning around those letters as quickly as possible over the next 2 weeks.
Great. So I will introduce myself. For those of you who don't know me, I am Jericha Senyak. I use she, her pronouns. And I am the accounting person for Independent Arts and Media. So I'm the person who sends you your financial reports every month, who does the accounting. If you have struggles or troubles with your reports, I'm the person who and generally ends up sending the corrections or the info. I also offer coaching around financial empowerment, budgeting, and other topics for all the independent arts and media projects. And in the rest of my life, I do accounting and finance consulting for arts organizations, arts nonprofits, and other fiscal sponsors in the Bay Area and beyond. And we're going to dive in today to this workshop on budgeting. This workshop is about budgeting in general with a focus on applying budgeting to CAC, but the concepts and tools that I'm going to be talking about today are not specific to CAC, because for me, trying to make brand new grant budgets for each and every grant that you apply to from scratch is an enormous stressor and not usually a good use of your time as somebody working within a project or organization. So we're going to talk a little bit today about grant approaches to budgets in general and how to translate budgets for grant purposes. So I'm just going to go ahead and share my screen. Lisa, I'm going to not be looking at the chat. If you can check the chat occasionally for questions, that would be great. And then we will get to a big Q&A section at the end. Please feel free to put your questions in the chat. Just know that I will not yet be looking at them till our Q&A session. If you have a burning question where you're like, Jericha, wait a second, something you said does not make sense to me, please just unmute yourself and be like, Jericha, wait a second. Something you said does not make sense to me, and we'll go from there. Because I want everybody to have as much access as they need. If I go too fast, let me know to slow down. Let me know to repeat anything. Because this is being recorded, you will get the slides, you will get the template that I share, and you will also get the recording. So here we go. Okay, so just a little bit about what it is that I'm planning to talk to you about today. What is a budget, really, and why should I make one, right? We are asked to make budgets for different grant applications, but for me, there are reasons to create budgets beyond just the fact that funders demand that you have one. How is a budget structured? What are the steps to actually building a budget? This is the thing that I get asked about the most. Where do I begin? Given that a budget is a bunch of functionally made up numbers, how do I start? Where do I actually crack open that code? What do I need to know about CAC budgets specifically? I've got some tips and overviews and notes for you here. We can dive into more specific questions as we go. A big one is, what are in-kind donations and how and why should I put them in my budget? In-kind donations might be a familiar concept for some of you. It's usually kind of a complex concept for some folks, and also it's really important to take the extra time to go over them because they can make a really big difference in how your application looks and how you're thinking about your own project and programming. And finally, just some extra budget tips and resources. Oh, and some time for Q&A, of course. Okay, so the big question, what actually is a budget? Does somebody want to give me their definition of a budget as you understand it? No one?
I'll
No one
try.
wants to venture?
I'll try.
Go for it.
I think I've talked to you enough times for it to start at least slowly sink in. So it's an imaginary plan that's supposed to accompany the narrative. So it's estimated cost, projected costs, and I mean, because I'm a creative person, it's really fictional. I mean, it's based in reality, but essentially you don't really know how it's going to look until you're at the end. So then you redo your budget so that it's more accurate every single time. So Jericha has been a wonderful tutor.
I love your definition, Maria, very much appreciate the word imaginative in there, right? So the way that I think about a budget is that it is a numerical statement of your plans, your dreams, and your values, whether it is for the whole organization that you're running and you're applying for organizational funding, or whether it is for a specific project or program that you're running. The budget is basically your way of saying in numbers what it is that you are planning to do. It says where you think your money comes from and how you intend to spend it, right? So emphasizing that idea of fictional that Maria said, right? We actually don't know what is going to happen. If any of us could see the future, we would not need to be in a budget workshop because we would be off, making millions off the lottery. And so the budget is our way of saying what are best of reality and what we think we are going to do. Importantly, a budget is not a set of hard rules that you have to follow, right? It's not like, okay, well, I said my budget is this, and if I deviate from that, I'm in trouble, right? It's an expression of best guesses and intentions. It does not need to, it almost certainly is not possibly going to match the reality that really takes place, nor is it a set of parameters which, if you don't stay within them, you will be punished. It's that you are trying to make a plan to follow to keep yourself in line, right? So I think of budgets, I'm just moving my Zoom windows around, as best serving us when they are a map, a blueprint, a compass, right? These are all words that mean orientations, right? Guidelines, plans, an expression of goals and values, right? If you are trying to build a house, for example, and what you want is a tiny house, your blueprint is going to show something small. If you are trying to build a house and you want a McMansion, your blueprint is going to show something gigantic. Neither of those blueprints is a house, but it tells you a lot about what that house is probably going to be like, right? So a budget is a way of saying where you're trying to go. Importantly, a budget should be as honest as possible. When we are trying to make a budget and a plan, the more we can say what we know and believe as honestly as possible, the better our budget is going to serve us. What a budget does not need to be is totally made up, right? There is some basis in reality, nor does your budget need to be set in stone, right? Once you make it, that doesn't mean it's it, that's the end. This is an important one. A budget is not always perfectly balanced or net to zero, right? Very often, in fact, I would say 99.998% of the time, when you are doing anything, the amount of money that comes in for your project or program or organization and the amount of money that goes out is not going to be exactly the same. It might be very close within a matter of, dozens or hundreds of dollars, but it is not going to be always perfectly balanced or always zero, nor does it need to be. Right? When we are actually making budgets for projects or programs, sometimes it is okay to have money left over at the end. And finally, it does not need to be exactly predictive of reality. I'm going to keep hammering this point, right? That a budget is a plan. It is not intended to be predictive of the future because the future is fundamentally unknowable. For me, a really solid and useful budget is specific. It reflects things that are relevant to you. It is honest, right? You are not making claims that you are going to spend money or earn money in a way that you know perfectly well doesn't actually match the reality of what you're capable of. It's aligned with your vision, right? And so if you are budgeting for an event and your desire is to have that event be accessible, then everything that is going into the event in terms of cost should reflect that, right? Maybe that means paying for an ASL interpreter. Maybe that means paying more for an accessible space. Whatever it is, those costs should be reflected in your budget because it needs to be aligned with your vision. A good budget is full of useful notes, right? So it's not just a set of numbers. If you don't keep notes in your budget as you go, you are going to forget 3 months later what the heck it is you said, right? If you say admin cost $500, what was that $500? Where did that number come from, right? I like to say be kind to your future self. For me, being kind to your future self is remembering that future you is thinking about a lot of other things and does not always know what the heck is going on 3 months ago. So leave those notes to be like, here's how I came up with this number. Here's what that number represents. Here's why I think that number is real. A really good budget for me is based on thinking through both hard reality and hopeful possibility. Hard reality is the facts of life, right? If we don't know any rich people, then it's probably not a good idea to put in our budget that we're going to make a ton of money in individual donations. However, if we have a big network community of people who really support what we're doing, hopeful possibility means that maybe a lot of people will be willing to give you a little bit of money. Finally, a budget needs to be the right shape for you, right? A good budget is one that is going to be reflective of your actual needs, right? A budget that is formatted or designed for, I don't know, a theater project is not going to work well for folks who do a set of events around, I don't know, Indigenous representation that have nothing to do with theater. A good budget is not going to be vague, right? Opposite of specific, it's going to have detail. Importantly, a budget should be easy for you to go back to. You don't want it to be hard for you to read or understand later. And finally, you don't want it to be fudged to make it work. The asterisk here is that occasionally when you are applying for grants, a funder is going to force you to put in a net zero budget. In that case, they're asking you to fudge it, right? Because that's not how reality works. But in general, what you want is to make sure that your budget, if it doesn't actually work out, if you have a big deficit, that tells you something important about your project or program that needs to be adjusted in your thinking. It's not an invitation to just put in some numbers and hope it magically works out. Any questions so far? Feel free to unmute or throw something in the chat. Give a couple seconds and move on. What is really a budget for? Right? When I'm thinking about budgeting, this is a CAC grant workshop. However, what I want to emphasize here is that a budget is first and foremost a tool to help you. Giving it to the funder is second to making a budget that helps you understand what you are trying to do. Whatever you're doing with your budget, it should help you support and advocate for your own project or organization. Maybe you never send it to a funder, right? Maybe you apply for a grant and you don't get the grant. The budget should still be helpful, right? The point is to sit down and make a budget for yourself that helps you understand what you are trying to accomplish. So no matter what funding comes through, you have a better grasp and a better set of plans for yourself. I like to use the acronym CALM when I'm thinking about budgeting. C for clarification, right? A good budget helps you understand the actual costs of your organization or project and see how much support you really need, right? So if you're trying to do something and you're just kind of like vaguely thinking about it in your head, you're like, oh my God, it's going to cost so much money. How am I ever going to do this? But if you actually sit down and make the budget for it and think through all those expenses, you're going to have, even if it's not a perfect number, a number that is much more specific than the vague cloud of thoughts in your head, right? So knowing, my budget's going to be somewhere between $20,000 and $40,000 for this project is really different than knowing, my budget could be any amount of money, or my budget's going to be between $100,000 and $150,000 for this project is really different, right? So clarification is the first thing that a budget does for you. Secondly, it helps you advocate, right? Budgets are huge tools for advocacy for your project because they show other people that you've thought through what it actually takes to do the thing that you're trying to do. When you have a budget, you can say, I have listed it out. It's going to take this much. This is all I need. You can help me out. You can see that I already know what this is going to take. This isn't some vague plan in my mind. This isn't some pipe dream. This is real. Limits. Again, when we're trying to make something happen, it can be really daunting or overwhelming to feel like, gosh, it could be like this tiny or this enormous. How big is it going to be? It feels very formless. So a budget helps you set clear parameters to work within so that you can right size your ideas and goals, right? If you make a budget and you're like, oh, realistically, I think that I can probably raise around $25,000, that lets you say, okay, given that, here's what I can pay people. Given that, I'm going to need space A instead of space B. Space B might be better, but space A is affordable to me and space B is not, or vice versa. And finally, a budget lets you make choices as you go after you've submitted your grant applications, whatever it is, you're in the middle of your project. Something happens, something goes wrong, somebody drops out, you don't get a grant you were hoping to get, a pandemic hits, whatever it is. Having a budget helps you identify what you've actually thought about as being essential, so that when you need to make tough decisions, you can actually say, well, here's everything that I have said I'm going to need. Which of these things can easily get cut? And having it down on paper or on your computer in an organized fashion where you've thought through all of it and listed it all out makes that decision-making process so much easier on the fly than if it's all just living in your head. Let's talk about the anatomy of a budget. What does a budget look like? When you are fiscally sponsored and you're applying for contributed revenue, right, grant funding, budgets are usually going to follow a pretty similar format every time. And this is going to be the format that I suggest you use for creating your own budget, which you can then massage as needed for different grant applications. Right? The general shape is going to remain the same whether you're a small project or a big company. It's just about the level of detail. That's what's really going to change. I'm going to encourage you, no matter what you're applying for, to create your own overall budget first for the thing that you're trying to do before you try and fit it into the format for any specific grant, right? Think through your own project goals in your own terms, in your own format. Really make a story for yourself that makes sense to you, and then ask yourself how each grant fits into the picture. What that does is then when you're trying to apply for multiple grants, which each have their own format for grant applications and grant budgets, you have one central document that represents your full thinking. And you can simply take from that as needed and translate it into the different formats of different funding. If you have an individual budget for every single grant that you apply for, one project, one budget, each time, you're going to have a really hard time seeing how they all fit together, seeing how they talk to each other. If you get part funding from one and it sort of applies to part funding for another, it's going to get really confusing. So make one overall plan for yourself and then see how it goes with each of the budgets. Income is always up at the top. So I like to start with earned revenue, right? Earned revenue is service or goods people pay for, right? So that's going to be things like ticket sales, merchandise or concession sales, workshop, teaching fees, performance fees. If you sell advertising in your publication, it might be advertising, it might be book sales, depending on what you're doing, right? It's where people give you money and get a thing. Contributed revenue is gifts or donations, right? Money that people give you just because they think what you're doing is wonderful and they want to support it, right? That is usually split out by type. So usually corporation, foundation, government, and individual. It might also include board or in-kind donations. It might include special event donations. You can get more or less granular with that. Those are your two sections up top: earned revenue, contributed revenue. In each of those sections, you can include a line just for the things that are relevant to you. If you don't have ticketed events, you don't need a line for ticket sales. If you don't sell books, you don't need a line for book sales. But if you do sell books, you should have a line for book sales, right? If you don't get corporate grants, fine, leave them out of your budget. If you are trying to get corporate grants, put them in, even if you don't have them yet. On the expense side, the first thing is going to be personnel. People are always up top. And personnel is anybody that you pay for their labor, right? It's usually split into employees and contractors. Some of you are going to have actual employees, people who are on salary where their benefits are paid. Some of you are just going to have contractors. So put into your budget the categories that make sense to you. It's really good to total salaries and benefits and total contractors. It's nice to split out those contractors into categories like artistic contractors, admin contractors, and program contractors. We'll get more into that, right? Really thinking about what are the different categories of those costs and be nice and detailed, right? Are you paying teachers? Are you paying performers? Are you paying artists? Are you paying staff? Are you trying to pay yourself for directing the project, right? All of those are personnel. Admin expenses are the costs of doing business, right? What does it actually take for you to keep the lights on, right? An office space, internet, telephone, insurance. If your project is kind of just you, a portion of your personal costs might go into those admin expenses. The larger your project, the higher these costs are, right? Don't under budget them because they're real. This is especially true if you're applying for organizational funding rather than project funding. But either way, make sure to actually include administrative costs in there. If you're not sure how much to put in, what you can think of it in a number of different ways. We can talk more about that later. But what's really important is to represent the fact that part of what it takes for you to do this work is to make sure that your Zoom subscription is paid for. And finally, program expenses are direct non-personal expenses related to your project or program, right? So that might be equipment, then your space rental, program travel, program supplies, right? Anything that is the cost of putting on your project or program that isn't a person and isn't just back-end admin expenses. The net for your budget is the income total minus the expense total. Some funders are going to ask you to have your net show as 0. That is made up. Your net in reality is pretty much never going to equal 0. Usually you are going to have a little bit more income or a little bit more expense. In general, it's good to try and budget to have a little bit of money left over, right? To try and have your income slightly exceed your expense is a good idea. It's not always possible. Okay, and here I am actually going to pull up a budget template, but I'm going to pause and see, does anybody have any questions about the kind of conceptual framework that I have laid out so far before we dive into actually looking at the spreadsheet? Looks like no. Cool, people seem good. Okay, so this is an example of a project budget template. This will get sent out and you can massage this to be of use to you in whatever project you want. You can see it's split out in the way that I described, right? So earned income up top with some different types of earned income up here. You can change these and rename these to be relevant to your project or your organization. Contributed income down here, and then you see a total of income. Expenses, you can see, are split out into salaries and benefits, different types of contractors. These are examples of expenses you might have. If your project or program is fairly small, you'll probably have fewer of these. You can roll these up into more lump sum categories, right? The larger your project is, the more detail it is helpful to have. Marketing expenses are usually considered part of general and admin, right? So that's advertising, marketing, printing, copying, Instagram posts, or whatever it might be, right? You can see general and admin expenses could be things like meeting food, insurance, postage, telephone. You may have more that you want to add. Some of these might not be relevant to you, right? Software subscriptions are a big one for a lot of people. I generally encourage folks not to have an individual line for every subscription, right? If you have an Adobe subscription and a Zoom subscription and a Dropbox subscription, you don't need an individual line for every one of those. That's a good place to use your notes field and say things like, for example, $40 Zoom, $30 Adobe per month. And you can do a little math right in here in your spreadsheet. This is a fun Excel trick, right? So you can say $40 times 12 for the year for my Zoom subscription, plus $30 times 12 months of the year for my Adobe subscription. That's $840 a year of subscription income, right? If you just put $840 in there, almost certainly you will never remember what that is, which is why this little note is so helpful. But if you have an individual line for Zoom and for Adobe and for whatever else it is, your budget is going to get really unwieldy really fast. So that's why I recommend always having a little bit of a balance between using your notes field and being specific in the categories that you have. And I do see some things in the chat, so I'm just going to make sure there's no burning questions in the chat. Business budgeting, I see. Yes, and so somebody is asking here, we can get to specific costs about what to include and what not to include in specific budgets. In general, anything that is a cost of doing business, if you are looking at your overall budget, it's really important to include that because that's part of what it actually takes to make this work happen, right? And then finally, program expenses down at the bottom might include program meals. It might include postage and shipping, travel, venue rental, right? You might have really specific ones. If you're a theater company, you might have props or costumes. If you're a photographer, it might have things like darkroom rental, right? So there's all kinds of different things that will go in there. And that's up to you to massage in the way that makes most sense to you. But this is a general format that you can use that is going to be applicable to pretty much every grant application you need to apply for, with a little bit of squeezing here and there. Okay. So let's talk about actually constructing a budget. The biggest thing to do is to take yourself through the story you're telling and ask yourself what you really need cash-wise to make it happen, right? So last week, Kyle was really talking about impact, right? What is the story of the impact that you're making? When you're thinking about that, that is really where your budget is coming from, right? Getting those categories that are relevant to your project, being kind to your future self about what it is that you are putting in there, and asking yourself, what am I trying to do? Right? That's your narrative, your goal, your vision, the outcome, the impact. What are you trying to accomplish? That's the first thing to ask yourself when you're building your budget. Then the second question is, what are the things I have to pay for in order to achieve my goal, my vision, my outcome, this impact, right? These are the things that are your expense categories. When you're thinking through, okay, I'm doing this thing, I have this plan, I'm imagining this work. If I want this to happen, what's everything I need to do? A way that you can think about this is walking yourself through each day, right? If it is an event, walking through the event, being like, who is at this event? Where is this event taking place? What kind of things are present at the event? If your project is something like a film, thinking about, okay, I'm on set. What are all the costs? What permits am I going to need to make this happen? How long is my shoot? Where am I going to submit the film afterwards, and how much are the fees, right? Thinking through the story is what gives you the categories of expense. Once you have the categories laid out in your budget, now the question to ask is, what's the smallest amount you can realistically spend and still feel that you succeeded at this project? Right? This is not a question of, can you afford this? Yet you're not asking yourself, what's the smallest amount of money that I can spend because I only have X dollars? But thinking about, if I want this to succeed, what's the minimum? This is your minimum budget, right? This is what, if you want to make this thing happen, you need to spend at least this much money. Now, ask yourself, are there people or things you would like to spend more on in an ideal world? Imagining that you actually get more funding, you get more support. This is your ideal budget. It's really valuable to think about being both a minimum budget and an ideal budget, and I'll show a tool for doing that in just a second. The reason being that you don't know yet which world you're going to end up in. And if you only think about your bare bones minimum budget, then if you get more funding, you may not actually have a good way to spend that, right? And also, if you've thought through what it would take to do things in the way that you really want them to be done, you can better advocate for getting that money. Adding in, what are the hidden costs, right? Have you left anything out of the budget? Like the time that you're spending. Have you paid yourself, for example? These are your indirect and admin costs, right? Do an extra go through to make sure that everything that it takes to really actually do this work is included or reflected somewhere in your budget. And finally, on the revenue side, what are all the realistic sources of cash support available to you? These are the grants that you're applying for. This is also going to be any people that you feel you can ask for individual donations. This is, do you have a cousin who works at Wells Fargo who would be willing to give you a grant? Do you have a relationship with stores in the neighborhood who are willing to donate either money or goods or supplies to your project? Do you have, right, all of these things? Can you sell cool merch? Of course, merch costs money, so you might need to spend some money on merch. right? All of these questions are putting that income in and then seeing the difference, right, between your income and your expense, your revenue and your expense categories, tells you how realistic that budget is and how close you are to your goals. Finally, it's really valuable to review all of the non-cash resources and support that you have available, right? So for example, if somebody is willing to donate space or donate time, or you have a bevy of volunteers, right? These are in-kind donations. And also some of these things can't be represented in a budget, but should be reflected in your budget notes. So that you can say, yes, I know that it looks like we're not paying anybody for this thing, but we have these eager volunteers who are really happy to help. So we can guarantee that this is going to happen, even though we aren't necessarily paying all these people. Okay. And in fact, I see a question from Neil here about volunteer time, right? So sometimes we're going to talk for a second later on about in-kind donations and when you can count donations of labor or time in your budget and when you have to basically just tell in the budget notes that that exists, because there are some kind of specific regulations around that. What is important is that when you are actually working on your budget, whether or not you're submitting it, that you have represented somewhere, even if it's just in words, right? Even if it's just in the budget notes, that you are relying on volunteer or donated time, because that helps you remember the fuller picture of your budget. And again, helps you advocate to others for the work that you're trying to do. And it lets you say, hey, look, we're doing all this volunteer labor over here. Imagine what we could do if we paid these people. And hopefully that will encourage people to give you more money. So what I want to emphasize in this is that budgets are narratives. The numbers in your budget are expressions of actions that you plan to take, right? Paying people, renting space, purchasing supplies, whatever it might be. Can you point to the place in your budget that reflects each part of the story that you're telling? This is the question that I want you to ask as you're going through your budget creation, right? Working with people usually means that there's going to be payments to people in the budget. Or if there aren't payments to people in the budget, there's going to be a note somewhere in there that says why. Doing an event shows up in your budget as space rentals or in-kind donations of space, production supplies, permit costs, right? All of the things that it takes to make an event happen. If you leave these costs out of your budget, it's going to be harder to make that event happen because you aren't budgeting for the things that it really takes to put your event on. Maybe you're engaging in research, right? That might cost stipends to interviewees. Travel, materials, right? Holding classes might be reflected in payments for space rental, to teachers, advertising for your classes, and so on. What kind of examples can you think of that are relevant to your experience? And I'm going to stop the share here for a second. What are some examples for you of places where your goals and values might be reflected in a budget number?
Artist fees.
Artist fees. Yes.
Yeah.
Absolutely. Tell us a little bit about what that looks like for your project.
Well, I think I got this from the NEA, so my budget is like trying to put a bunch of projects into an organization. But like there's some music festivals, and so like while the minimum budget might look like $300 a band, the ideal budget is $1,500 a band.
Right.
So
great. Absolutely. Yeah. Absolutely. Well, and that's a great expression, right? If you have more money, what you're saying is that the place I would put this is more money towards artists. That's an expression of your value and your goal, which is to pay artists for their time.
That's exactly my goal.
Yeah. Yes. Yeah. I love this goal. I love this goal for us. Some other folks, what other places, what other things can you see where you can think of places where something that's specific to your work would be reflected in a numeric space in your budget?
So I put in the chat community engagement activities, and that's so in alignment to what the CAC asks for all the time, right? So
nothing.
Sorry, Mary Jean.
Yes, nothing.
Okay, Mary Jean's muted. Sorry, Maria. So tell us about what do community engagement activities cost? What does that look like? What kind of expenses does that include for you?
So like, for example, like holding a forum or an open house, or it could even be as simple as sort of like putting together packets for like onboarding families. So like
Right.
there's a whole range of community engagement, which really shows about how you're, doing programming that's reflective of the community and also engaging with the community.
Right. And so a great example there is like, for example, if you say, oh, we're going to do these open houses, right? That might look like, either donated or rented space for the open house. That might look like food for people who are attending, right? Handouts is going to be printing costs, right? And so thinking through what are the things that I want to do that I say I'm going to do, and what does it cost to do them? What are the expenses associated? I see a raised hand from BK.
Yeah, I just want to add to what Maria was saying. Stipends for participants. I
Absolutely.
think I know I hear people talking about the amount of time that they volunteer, but often when we're asking community to volunteer, we need to ensure that we are compensating them for their time
Absolutely.
and not just accepting free labor. So I would definitely add that in as a budget item.
I want to,
Absolutely, BK. I love that.
sorry,
Please.
I wanted to cycle over back to the idea of like in-kind labor, because, for 10 years, myself definitely, and Kitty have just been kind of making little boxes work. And I feel like I always feel a certain type of inappropriate around saying, well, I put in all this labor because like, it just feels like well, why are you doing this? Like kind of how to structure the answer to that in numbers. Like, why are you putting in so much of your time into this place if there's not like an immediate like payoff, like just believing that the future will pay off. So Neil mentioned it too in the chat, just this like how much in-kind labor is like appropriate, because then it starts to look in the numbers like, well, I put in 40 hours every week and I'm worth this much. I think it starts to look a little intense or serious to say huge dollar amounts are in-kind donations.
This is a great question. And I actually have a slide that's specifically about when you can and can't value something as in-kind donations. But something that's worth saying is when you're making a budget, part of what you should be, if you are donating skilled labor and you're not getting paid for it, put paying yourself in your budget, right? What that looks like is not saying this is an in-kind donation, but saying, actually, I'm right. You don't need to put it in as an in-kind donation. If what you want is for a funder to pay you for that, put it in the budget and don't put in the in-kind donation up top for it. Say, this is an expense that I am incurring. And what then is, for example, if you don't get the funding that you want, you're going to be the one who takes that hit, right? You're going to cut payments to yourself rather than cut payments, say, to the artist you're working with, right? Or your rent or whatever it is. But ask for it. Ask for what you think you want. See what the budget looks like when you value your labor. Maybe it's going to be really daunting. Maybe it's like, well, we can't possibly make that. And you can be like, okay, well, what if I paid myself something? Right? So actually asking people to pay you for your time is really, really important, because I think a lot of what happens in our sector, right, in the arts specifically, is there is this assumption that people just do this for love. Right? And like how many people here have donated a zillion hours of their life to the work that they love? I bet every person here has gone many, many hours unpaid for the labor that they love. And I'm seeing all the thumbs up, right? All of us are familiar with this. It is a toxic expectation. And part of why this happens, sorry, Lisa.
I just wanted to add something, but you keep going, finish your thought.
What I was going to say is that it's really important to remember that part of this comes from the fact that artists are not given the opportunity to learn how to ask to get paid. You have to put yourself as an expense. It doesn't mean that expense is going to get covered. It doesn't mean your budget is going to work out that way. But if you don't ask for it, no one is going to give you the money for it. And so get used to asking for it, even if the answer is no, because we want to be pushing funders to see what it actually costs to do this work. Because most of us are not in a place where we can just do labor for free for the rest of our lives. Lisa, please.
So what I was just going to add was also think about it proportionate to the budget you're projecting.
Right.
So like there's the reality of I'm putting in 40 hours a week. I'm only getting paid for 5. I wish I was at least getting paid for 20 of it. put that number in. Don't, because
Right.
like I know there is always a concern of like, well, if I actually put in the value of my labor in a dollar amount, am I now overinflating the budget and people are just going to look at it like it's ridiculous? Like there is a balance there where like, if you're putting together a program that's going to cost $20,000 for everything except you, then think about, okay, well, if I was going to hire somebody else to be the project manager for this,
Right.
I would probably pay them $5,000, even if it's you actually doing the work. Put that dollar amount in.
Yep.
So think about it in proportion to like the full picture. And if you weren't paying yourself to do the labor you're already doing, like we kind of fill in for free when we can't afford to pay somebody else. That's where a lot of this comes from.
Yep. That's such a good point, Lisa. That's exactly how I would approach it in these cases. But when you're making your own budgets, it's really good when I'm talking about saying make an ideal budget and make a minimum budget. Put what you want in the ideal budget. The ideal budget doesn't have to be what you submit. The ideal budget doesn't have to be what actually happens, but it's worth seeing what it looks like to tell yourself that story, even if you don't tell anybody else that story. Be like, well, what is that reality? Right? Something to bear in mind when you're making a budget too is that what you don't put into the budget is sometimes a glaring hole. Imagine that you're a grant panelist and you're looking at a budget, right? So the next question that I have on my slide is, can you think of examples of project or program narratives that aren't reflected accurately in the budget? If you were a grant panelist and you're looking at a grant budget and you realize there's a disjunct here between what this person says they're going to do and what I see in the budget, what might that look like?
I would say to that, the answer to that, but also something that Lisa said to me a long time ago that really helped is, if you can step outside of like, I would do this for free, and the last thing, is kind of me getting paid and all of this stuff, just the thought of when you show that everyone involved is getting paid, it makes you look like you know what you're doing. And it makes you
Correct.
look like you're doing things in the right way that a smart business person approaches it. And that's helped me to get out of my own head with that. In addition to the thing that Lisa said earlier of, get out of yourself and just imagine this is a position. I'm
Right.
describing
You're
a
paying someone
position
else.
that exists. Coincidentally, I'm the
Right.
person that does this position, but I'm
Right.
just saying this position of project director, project manager exists. How much does this person need?
Yep.
In a reasonable scenario. But yeah, it would just you are it's exactly what Jericha just said. It would seem like a hole if someone came to you and said, oh, I'm doing this programming, but I'm not paying key people involved. You'd go,
Right.
That's odd. So
Jericha, can you
But-
speak about how to like when you said like these budgets don't have to go to net zero, they don't have to equal out, you don't have to show that like everything is tit for tat. Like I think that's where Lisa's talking about like the overinflation. Like if I added in all my hours, like it would be more than we even make in a year, And so
Totally. Right.
there's an appropriate amount, but how do you like massage in that appropriate amount with the correct like number narrative that doesn't
Sure.
not equal net zero in the end, or some kind of at least healthy
Sure.
balance or not extreme deficit? I think
Great
that's
question. Great question. And right, I think the important thing to, and we're going to get into this in a second, it's valuable to make multiple budgets with multiple scenarios in them. Right. And to be like, okay, what does it look like? If I put in all my hours, what is that number? Is that number 50,000? Is it 100,000? Is it 500,000? Because there's a big difference between those numbers, and actually seeing exactly how big it is lets you make decisions about how much of it you are going to put in your final budget. Right? If you're like, it turns out if I put in every hour that I think I wish I was getting paid for, that number actually is $85,000 a year. You can be like, okay, if our project budget, if our whole organizational budget for the year is only $50,000, obviously I'm not just add $85,000 of myself into that budget because that more than doubles my budget. What feels like a good chunk of that? Right. And there's no right answer. There's no correct way. No one is applying a formula to this where it's like, oh, you didn't do the formula, so tut, tut, tut. Right. A lot of it is about like, does it pass the smell test? Does it feel fair? Does it feel proportional? And also, can you ramp it up year over year, right? Maybe your overall organizational budget this year is $50,000. You're putting $15,000 of your own time into this budget, but next year your budget is going to be $65,000 and you're going to put $20,000 of your own time. Or your budget's going to be $100,000 and you're going to put $25,000, right? Think about it not just in terms of one year as well, or one project. Think about also growing over time. If you ask for something now, it is going to look much more reasonable to ask for more later. Whereas if you always ask for nothing, you're always going to get nothing, right? Things are going to stay the same size. I saw a couple things. Childcare. Can you put childcare in? Absolutely. Definitely put childcare in. If you can't do this work without childcare, 100%, right? If you are asking people to show up for an event where you need them to be there and their families, put in childcare. Childcare is 100% an acceptable cost, right? That's an accessibility cost. That's a really important one. Same with food for meetings. Ralph, I feel like you've had your hand up forever.
Yeah, I'm just, I made a huge mistake last time on my CAC grant. I didn't include IAM fees.
Ah,
And so we ended up paying from other sources in order to do it because I didn't want to represent the IAM fees when I didn't include it in the budget. And what's the best way to put that? Is that under administrative?
that's an
Model
administrative
A.
cost. Yes, that's an administrative cost, 100%. Yep. So, you know, right in there with like bank fees and insurance and all that, fiscal sponsor fees. That's a great one. And in fact, what I'm going to do is before I send out the budget template that I'm working on, that I'm sharing today, I will put that as a category in there so that nobody forgets it. Somebody asked, what category do you put childcare fees in? It can be whatever. We can go wherever you want, right? There's no hard, fast budgets are up to you, right? For me, that's a program expense. That's a direct cost of offering the program. You can just have a line called childcare, right? You could also have something that's event expenses if it's related to an event, and it can go in there. You get to decide how granular it is. I'm going to move on a little bit, but I want to have one more answer to the question of if you were looking at somebody's grant application and you felt like, there's a disjunct. Where are some places that you might see a discrepancy between the story that's being told and the numbers that you see?
I wanted to just say that with our budgets and stuff, it doesn't necessarily reflect the donation of the campground that the Presidio gifts us. So that's another place where
Mary Jean, that's a great one. And that's worth putting in either as a budget note, right, in your space rental, saying space, and there are budget notes, and all grant applications almost always have a space for budget notes saying there is no cost put into this budget for space rental because we are gifted this, or you can add that as an in-kind donation, right? So that's a really good example. And it's important to say these things because if you are getting all these goods and services, right, donated, it's really important to represent that support is part of your project, to tell that is part of the story, right? There's lots of things in the chat now, which I'm going to come back to because I want to make sure that we have time to get through all the material. If there's anything burning, speak now. Otherwise, what I will do is just move on to the slides. No burning questions? Great.
Okay, sorry.
Oh, please.
Regarding, I've been trying to, find the right spaces to put on some of these events, and especially in the city of San Francisco, like there's so much privatization of public resources happening. And so, say you want to do some kind of night cinema in the park type thing on a smaller scale, there are spaces to do that, but they're for profit. They're paying a lot of fees or whatever, but the whole point is, venture capitalism. Like they're coming at it from such a different perspective than what those of us putting these budgets together are focused on. Yep. So that's something that always feels like really out of step with, not against paying living wages and none of that. It just it feels a little, maybe I don't want to go into business with these people. And yet they have this resource that I think think would be really well suited to the project or the community.
And this is a really good question about funding and resources in general, which, I don't think we really have time to get into all the details of this today, but this is also true of some funding sources, right? You might get offered a grant or see an opportunity for a grant that is either from a funder who you have ethical qualms about engaging with. And that's something that's really valued, right? Like, is this money worth it to you? And also, there are funds that come with strings attached, right? Either the requirements for getting the money are just like really a pain in the butt. A lot of city funding is this way. It's like there's a lot of money there, but the amount of work and labor and admin time that it takes to basically make those grant requests and grant reimbursements is so high that those grants actually end up being much less valuable, you know. Or it might be that you actually have to like squeeze or massage your program to fit into somebody's parameters, which aren't real. You know, is it worth it to do that just to get those funds? Is it worth it to you to give money to somebody who you feel squicky about in order to get the resource? Everybody has to make those calls, and it's really hard to have, you know, a given rule of thumb about when to make those calls or not. But that is part of budgeting, right? Part of budgeting is saying, what are the resources available to me, and which of those resources am I comfortable pursuing? Because sometimes it is okay to leave money on the table if that money is tainted for you, right? I want it to be really clear that, like, again, this isn't venture capital. This is not some kind of exploitative for-profit scenario. We are not required to sacrifice the integrity of the work that we are doing just to get a buck. Everybody in this room has already, by the virtue of the work that you are doing, proven that you can make amazing things happen on a shoestring. I have never met an artist who could not make incredible stuff happen on a shoestring budget, right? And so knowing that your creative resources are such that you can do amazing things with very little, it is valuable to say, I don't need to sacrifice my morals in order to get a little bit extra. And somebody in the for-profit community might be like, well, but you know, you could have gotten that. Oh, well. Oh, well, that's not what we're doing here. This is not for profit. That's the entire point, is that we are doing this work on our own terms and in our own way. Sometimes that makes it really hard to pay the bills, right? Like, it is a compromise. It is not an easy set of decisions to make, but it is up to you every time. And you should never feel bad about saying no to funding or resources that don't feel right to you. Okay. Oh, no, I'm really glad you brought that up.
Thank you for that great answer.
Okay, moving on. So what we've talked about already a lot today is kind of different budget models. So I'm going to introduce here a concept that I call three bears budgeting. I got this idea from Yesenia Sanchez, who is the interim executive director at Intersection for the Arts. She's an amazing finance wizard. And she has a format for budgeting, which she calls Buddha budgeting because of the middle way. I have a similar format. I call it three bears budgeting, which is too hot, too cold, and just right. So the concept behind three bears budgeting, or Buddha budgeting, is just the fact that it's really hard to budget when there's lots of variables flying around, right? You don't know everything that is going to happen. Whether or not you get a giant grant, whether or not you can rent a certain space might make a huge difference to your project. To work with uncertainty, try budgeting for different scenarios until you come up with one that feels plausible and doable. A too cold budget, which we're going to look at in a second, is your bare minimum, right? Ooh, it's too cold. Things are not going well. You get less than you hope for, right? Support is limited. You can't afford things. What can you do with what you have, right? This is your shoestring budget. We already talked about what the bare minimum budget looks like. This is basically, if everything goes wrong, can you still do the thing? What are you going to pay for if you don't have any extra spending money? The too hot budget, on the other hand, is your best case scenario, right? This is not like, okay, somebody gives you $1 million, but it does mean things are going well for you, right? You get the grant, your classes are full, your tickets are selling. Right now, how will you spend this money? The reason that it's really valuable to do both a too hot and a too cold budget is because sometimes it's really valuable to plan for the best and not just the worst, because if you don't plan for the best, at least a little bit, then when good things happen, you might not be ready, right? You want to be ready to manage more money. You want to be able to make good decisions, to have thought through what your priorities and values are if you get extra. If you get extra unexpectedly and you haven't thought about what you're going to do with it, it might be a lot harder for you to manage those funds in a way that is actually reflective of what you want to do. The just right budget is the happy medium, right? It's between your too hot and too cold scenarios, which feels fairly plausible in terms of revenue. When you have a fairly plausible sense of revenue, how will you plan to spend that money in alignment with your goals? right? And so the budget template that I have for you actually has a scenario budget tab in it, which I'll show you right now, right? It's just a 3-column budget, and you can add as many columns, right? You can save as many versions of this as you want to work through as many scenarios. It doesn't just have to be too hot or too cold. It could be 4 different scenarios. It could be like, what if we do this program? What if we do it in this space? What if we hired that person versus this person, right? This lets you think through multiple scenarios so that you have actual real live numbers to work with in the event of different future possibilities. I cannot overemphasize how helpful it is to think these things through ahead of time. When you have thought all of these things through, you can say, I'm going to pick the thing that feels most likely right now. That's your budget. If it turns out not to be that way, that's okay. It's not going to exactly be whatever your budget is anyway. But the goal is to find something that feels like it makes sense to you under the current circumstances. And if those circumstances change drastically, to have some backup to go back to and be like, okay, well, what did I say I was going to do if things didn't go that way? Any questions about the Three Bears budget scenario? Cool. Okay, so you have your budget. You've made a budget. You've sat down, you've thought through, this is what I am trying to do. This is before you start applying for grants, right? Whatever it is, put in everything that you're trying to do, whether it is all the CAC grant, whether it is any earned income, individual donations, whatever it is, you have your whole story written out. Now it's time to do a CAC program budget. Not everybody here is necessarily applying for a program grant from CAC. Some of you might be applying for Gen Ops grants. We're going to get to that in a second. So CAC asks you to submit a project budget for the program grants in a specific format. Again, having your budget created for yourself separately outside of CAC will let you have a really good picture in your head that you can then translate into CAC's format more easily. Something to note about CAC's project budget is it asks for your expenses only. It does not ask you to detail your income. It is saying, how much money are you asking CAC for, and what are you going to do with that money? That is probably only a portion of your overall story, which is fine. The first thing they ask you for in the program budget is personnel. There are 3 types of personnel that they ask you to choose from: artistic, admin, and technical, right? So each personnel line that you add into your project budget for CAC, you're saying this is artistic, this is an admin person, this is technical. They ask for the job title, the rate of pay, and the number of staff, right? That might be 1. It might be, right, 0.5% because you might be doing all the things, right? That's what CAC is asking for. So it's helpful, again, to have this kind of information in your own budget so that it's really easy for you to translate it out. Being as detailed as possible in the description shows that you've really thought this through, right? So if you are hiring a lot of people, really take the time to put everybody in so that it's really, you've got a really beautiful picture of what all those expenses are. The second section is just called operating and production expenses. That's it. It's like one whole overhead line for the rest of your budget. This is where you're going to add in expenses from your admin and your program sections of your budget. You need to manually add a line for each expense, right? You click a plus button and then you describe what the expense is, and then you put the dollar amount. You can write quite a lot in those fields, right? So you can be fairly granular. You can say things like space rental, rehearsal space rental, 4 hours at $50 an hour, right? Being detailed, really good. Again, try and put yourself in the shoes of somebody who is looking at your application. Do they have enough information to understand what you're planning to spend and why without drowning in detail, right? Again, don't put in an individual line for your Zoom subscription, your Adobe subscription, and your Dropbox subscription. They don't need to know that. They might not even need to know your subscription total. You could just say, admin and office expenses. Do they have enough in there to understand what you're planning to spend and how it relates to the story you've told in your application of why and how you're doing what you're doing? Try and put your expenses in a clear order that's easy to follow, right? Having your existing budget already written out will make it really easy for you to just go down line by line and just add in one at a time into that budget, right? If you're staring at the CAC budget and you haven't made a budget outside, you're going to have to be like, wait, okay, this, oh, wait, no, that, oh, wait, hold on, did I account for this, right? Again, emphasis is on making a budget that works for you outside so that it's easy to put it in. For things like admin costs, it's okay to summarize, right? So things like postage or bank fees, you can just make one line that's called office and overhead. But production and direct program costs, be very specific about those, because especially for the impact grants, right? Those are the places where you're saying, this is what it costs to do the thing. Let the grant panelists know that you've really thought through the details of what that takes. In general, admin costs shouldn't be more than 25% of a program budget. Some budgets have caps on how much you can put in. I think Lisa put a note in about some budgets actually have caps on fiscal sponsor fees that you can put in. So if you run into trouble with that, massage as needed. When you're doing your project budget in CAC, that adds up automatically when you put things in, right? So you don't have to put in a total. What is important is that as you put in all of your expenses, that you're matching your budget spreadsheet, or at least that you're matching the request, right? If you're asking for $25,000 from CAC, you want to be making sure that your expenses add up to about $25,000. Any questions about this? We're going to move on to other budget info, things they don't fund, in a second. Feel free to just unmute. Nothing so far. Great. This is some more general notes on CAC budgets. Okay, there's some specific FYIs that you'll want to know when you're putting your budget in. Right? Again, don't forget to use the notes field. The notes field is just a text box where you can add nuance, right, and help contextualize your current proposal in relation to your past activity, whatever it might be, right? So questions that were being asked about, like, where do I put in the value, intangible value, things that I can't represent? This is where you should be putting that in. Some things to know that CAC does not fund. They do not fund hospitality expenses, meals, or food. If you have expenses like that in your budget, there's a way to represent that without putting it into the CAC funding request. But do not put a line item in your CAC expense, in your CAC program budget, for hospitality expenses, meals, or food. They don't fund out-of-state travel, equipment purchases. Rentals are okay if you're purchasing supplies and materials, that's okay. But you can't buy a printer. Fundraising expenses, you can't pay your grant writer or your fundraising event costs out of your CAC grant. Services or programs restricted to private groups or members only, right? So it needs to be accessible to the public. They don't fund construction projects or land purchases, which I doubt most people here are trying to do, but it's worth saying. They don't fund debt repayment. And this is important, check the grant period for the grant, because they don't fund expenses that are incurred before the start of that period or after the end of it. Remember that your CAC grant might just be one part of your overall program, right? There is on the program budget a field called additional project cost. If your total budget is $50,000 and you're applying for $25,000 in CAC funding, you can just put your additional $25,000 as a lump sum into that line. That's all it takes, right? So anything that you have in your budget that's not covered by CAC can just go in that additional project cost line. A quick note about CAC's operating grants. Operating grants require a one-to-one match for the request amount, and you need to detail the type of funds that are going to be used for the match. They can be in-kind donations, it's worth noting. The operating grants do not require a project budget or even an operating budget. They do require you to have a budget over $250,000 a year to be eligible for funding. And that doesn't mean that you had $50,000 a year last year, or if you had $50,000 in revenue last year and you're like, this year we will have $250,000. They require you to have demonstrated that your operations were $250,000 a year or more before you can be eligible for the funding. This is a place where people can easily get confused because the wording is super confusing. California Arts Council requires what's called a 2-year budget snapshot for all grants. This is not a projected budget. This is a report or your project or organization's actual income and expense for the last 2 fiscal years, right? So that's going to be 2022 and 2023, or FY22 and FY23 if you're on a fiscal year, right? So it says budget snapshot. The budget snapshot is not the thing we are talking about. It's just a report of income and expense. If you're a Model A project, that's just your last 2 years of income and expense reports from Indie Arts. If you're a Model C, hopefully you have your own records of what your income and expense was for the last 2 years. This section, the budget snapshot, doesn't require a ton of detail. It's just total earned, total contributed on the revenue side, and total personnel and total operating and production on the expense side. So it's pretty simple. You just need totals. Questions about this?
I have a question. So we're applying for one of our projects that is a new project, and the last projects were not with the same team, but we can show our last 2 years of where our money and fundraising is going, but they're like, we weren't part of the same fiscal sponsorship. Please advise.
I think, tell me more about the struggle.
So the project we're applying with this year is a live theatrical production. My experience that I'm bringing to put this on is best reflected with like the most fundraising and income for a music festival and a short film.
Okay.
So I have complete budgets for both of those events, which would bolster my case. Otherwise, it's going to look like we've never done anything, which is just not true.
Right. I mean, I would say put in the numbers that you have, right? And it's going to take a little bit of translation, right? A little bit of kind of like sticking things together to kind of put those numbers in. But again, because the budget snapshot is really just totals, right? They're not asking for this like totally detailed breakdown. I would say I think it's probably fine to just put in what you have for those snapshots. And I mean, Lisa might want to jump in and advise for that. But for me, because you're not in a terrible situation there, just because it's not asking for the super granular detail.
Okay, thank you.
So I would just put in what you have. Alistair.
Can I actually add a comment to that real quick?
Oh, Lisa, please.
One thing to think about, Una, is to the extent you're relying upon a past project that you did that's not necessarily the same team, not really under the same fiscal sponsor, but it's a natural continuation of what you're pitching now. It's really about just thinking about like, are you being honest in the representation of this being a consecutive program and like an ongoing thing? And like, I'm not concerned about the fiscal sponsorship not being with the first one, like that sort of stuff we don't care about. It's more just like, if you feel like if there's I call it the sniff test. If someone were to take a sniff at this and be like, I think you're bullshitting, then maybe you need to think about it. But if it's like, no, this is a natural progression, it makes sense based on the evolution of the work and how the group is evolving. Changing people doesn't always make a big difference either. So those are the sorts of things to ask yourself in those situations.
Awesome. Thank you so much.
Alistair.
Yeah, I wanted to ask a couple of questions. One is about the $250,000 eligibility. So you have to have had that, you have to show that that was your budget for the last 2 years, not that it's your budget now and will continue to be your budget in the future.
It needs to be your revenue, your stated revenue, in the line where it's like, right, CSC is like, what is your revenue? And it needs to be realistic, right? If you were $200,000 last year and you're projected to be 250 this year, Lisa, do you know whether they are comparing it to your 2-year budget snapshot for eligibility purposes, or whether it's about your current year budget?
All right, ask that question again. Comparing what to what?
For eligibility for the ops grants, are they looking at your 2-year budget snapshot to determine your eligibility, or is it for what you're stating your current year revenue is?
I think they're looking, because I don't know.
This is a good question. I actually don't know.
If there's a separate field question of what's your current budget, and then they ask for the 2 years of financials. Yeah, I don't know.
I actually don't know. Alice, this is probably a question for CAC. And I actually have a note at the very, very end in my kind of like extra FYIs. If you're not sure about something and you can't get a clear answer, ask the funder. So this is something that I would go to CAC and be like, please clarify what the eligibility is. There may be like an FYI somewhere, which I just missed, about how they determine that eligibility. but I think the answer here is that neither Lisa nor I know for sure the answer to that question.
Well, and Una, where did you get this cut and paste from the chat where it says must have proven annual budget of 250K? Do they use that language, proven annual budget?
That was in a few slides ago on the CAC.
Okay,
Yes,
so
they
that
do.
tells me
Yes.
they're going to look at your past financial reports to see if you actually had 250K.
Right, for the operating grant.
This is for ops.
Yeah.
This is for ops only. Yeah, the program grants do not require you to be over $250,000. This is just for the operating grant.
But they do require the budget snapshot.
And they do require the budget snapshot. Yes, everything, all of the applications require the budget snapshot.
Cool.
But I think,
Which is the 2 years of financial reports.
Right.
okay,
That's correct.
interesting. Okay, I thought that the guidelines on the general operating grant, to my knowledge, just said that you have to have a budget between 250K and $1 million. So that feels a little more vague.
Yeah, I would double check on this.
Okay.
Because if you have been close to 250 for the last couple of years and now you're hitting 250, that's, I think, is a different scenario probably than like you've been 100,000 for the last 2 years and this year you're 250. Does that make sense? Like they're looking for, is this realistically your budget size or is this a reach?
Right. Okay. Sweet. And then the other question I have is, you were, I don't know if I remember exactly the context, but you were saying that something about putting, like, if you're asking for, 30,000 from them and the rest of your budget is larger than 30,000. You were saying they just want you to fill out the budget to show how you're going to spend the 30,000 and then you can throw the rest of your, like,
That's right. That's right. They are only asking for how you're going to spend the money that you are asking for from them.
Okay. Okay. Even in the operating grants.
The operating grant does not ask how you're going to spend the money.
That's a good point. Okay.
Yeah. The operating budget doesn't ask. And then I had to like triple check this because I was like, surely somewhere you have to put in your operating budget. But as far as I can see, and I went through, like I made myself a profile on CAC and I went through the applications line by line, and I did not see a place anywhere on the ops grants where they are asking for an organizational operating budget or an expense budget of any kind. It appears to me that they ask for the revenue, they ask for your match, and they ask for the amount that you're applying for. And of course, the budget snapshot from the prior years. But as far as I can see, they are not asking you how you're going to spend the funds. I see little boxes raising hand.
Hey, yeah, I was asking a similar question about like the 250 amount versus like again going back to like in-kind donation, effort, labor, budget. We could say it's 250, but that's a little wonky. So I was just gonna ask about that.
Sure.
And then just how to qualify up and coming grants that if they come in, they'll boost your budget into that much, like we've
But
been
you're not sure if you're gonna get them.
or what the amount.
Right,
We
right.
were
And so
approved for 100K from the Arts Commission, but we don't know what they're actually going to give us,
We'll
so
see.
it's like,
right. And so that is a situation where you haven't hit that mark yet.
Yeah.
But once that is in your budget, then you will be eligible for that funding.
Yeah,
yeah, I think that was the same question basically.
Great.
like
Great.
that like minimum budget, like median
Oh, and then
max.
the
too-
question
too close, whatever.
being that since it's a fiscally sponsored project, are we talking about like 250 showing up in our IAM accounts or 250 for our overall operating expenses for the entire place?
Probably overall.
Is kind of
Overall. You're a Model C, it is your overall. It's not just your fiscally sponsored amount.
Yeah.
okay for them.
Okay. In-kind donations. So we've been waiting for this one, and this is where I get very specific about how in-kind donations work. An in-kind donation is a donation of goods or services that you would otherwise have had to pay for. So the bad news here is that if you are running a project and you are donating all your time and energy, your time does not count as an in-kind donation. It seems like it should, because there would be no project without you. But the fact is that it is just you. It is you doing it, right? It is the cost of stuff that you need to pay for otherwise. I have a lot of feelings about this. It is a way that I have a lot of feelings about this. There are some reasons why this kind of makes sense. It keeps people from wildly overvaluing donations on their own individual taxes, but it causes a ton of problems because the entire nonprofit sector is so reliant on valued labor. When you do have in-kind donations that are counted as in-kind donations, you should add them to your program budget or your organizational budget. It helps you see a more accurate picture of your real costs and also helps you see an accurate picture of the support available. The way that I think of in-kind donations is that an in-kind donation is like a donation of cash that someone's already spent on a thing for you, right? It's always shown as both income and expense. So it nets to zero, right? It doesn't give you extra spending money because it's been spent on something really specific, but it increases the overall size of the organization, your overall picture of support, right? So for example, if you're having an event and a local business donates food, that is an in-kind donation of the value of the food up in your revenue section and an expense in your program meals section corresponding to the same amount, right? It's like they gave you some money and were like, you can only spend it on this food. In-kind donations should only be accepted if they make sense for your organization, right? This is very important. Make sure to value in-kind donations as honestly and accurately as possible, and don't include in-kind gifts of anything you wouldn't truly choose to pay for, right? So my kind of extreme example of this is if you are Alcoholics Anonymous and somebody's like, I'll donate a case of wine to your meetings. You can be like, that's not an appropriate in-kind donation for my organization. Similarly, if you are a theater company and someone's like, I'll donate a car to you, you're like, I don't need a car. A car is not a valuable donation for me. There are some exceptions to this when it comes to in-kind donations that you can turn around and sell. Those are complicated. If you have questions about that, ask me outside of this call and we can talk about it. Donated services, right, people's time, can only be counted as an in-kind donation if those services require expertise you would otherwise need to pay for, right? This is specialized skills like a plumber, an architect, a lawyer. A grant writer who is a specialist grant writer counts. You writing the grant by yourself, even though you have a ton of experience doing it because you have been writing grants trying to keep your organization afloat, unfortunately does not count, right? I count because I'm an accountant. I don't count if I am doing, I don't know, mosaic work on somebody's cool art wall, because that's something that I like to do, but is not something that I am specialized at or that anybody would ever pay me to do. To add an in-kind donation into your budget, add the value of the donated item up top in the in-kind donation line, add the value of the donated item to the appropriate expense line down below. Some things are much easier to value as in-kind than others, right? So an easy in-kind donation to value is when somebody buys stuff for you. If you have bought something for your own organization, whether it is event insurance, whether it is food for an event, whether it is you have purchased a subscription for somebody who is working with you, that's an in-kind donation. Put it in your budget. When it comes to services, think really carefully, right? Volunteers, not in-kind donations. Put a budget note about the volunteer labor you're relying on, and also maybe put in your budget some time for those people to get paid, right? You can ask for something to be covered, which you are currently getting donated for free. You can put it in your budget as an expense and hope that somebody will pay for that expense. That's not the same as an in-kind donation. An in-kind donation is saying we have received non-cash support. Okay, I'm guessing people are going to have some questions about in-kind donations. Throw them at me. We have a few minutes.
What
it doesn't
if,
seem like, please.
So a member of my staff received a fellowship, which will pay his salary for 2 years, but pay him to work with us. So I don't know if that's in kind or something else.
That's a great question. It's paying him directly?
Yes, including benefits.
That's a good question. I personally would put that as an in-kind donation.
Yeah.
Right. Like CAC is not going to check and be like, well, whose name is on the check? Because if the fellowship is to pay for working with you, to me, that is a donation supporting his time with your organization. That does make sense to me as an in-kind donation. So it'd be the value of the fellowship up top and the value of his salary down below.
Okay. Cool.
there is a circumstance under which that might just be like, we don't have to pay for this position because somebody got a fellowship to do it. But to me, this seems pretty cut and dried.
Yeah. Okay, sweet.
And I know that there was some mention in the chat of like, what about the time that people have spent like becoming experts or, masters in their craft? Is that an in-kind donation? And the answer to that is we can't account for that. If you want to represent recognition for people's skill or time or labor that is not spent directly on your project, you can always add honoraria, right? So honoraria is basically if you want to say, we are working with somebody and we want to basically give them some money to support their life as part of valuing their labor and forwarding our own mission, including that kind of stipend is an expense you can put in your budget, right? Similar to what BK was saying about the importance of honoring community for participating in our work and not just expecting that community members will show up for free, right? You can say, actually, we are going to give stipends or give honoraria to people for their time participating just because the value of their gifts is meaningful to us. You can budget for that. Again, it doesn't mean that it's going to get paid for, but you can put it in your budget and ask for money to cover it and say, if what you want to do is respect the work we're trying to do, you, O funder, will cover that cost. This is just kind of a last wrap up about making your budget work, right? So it's daunting to make budgets because you when you sit down and make a budget that you might not have enough funds to do the thing, right? And that is a scary thing to sit down and be like, if I write down all of what it takes to actually make this, that number at the bottom might not look like a number I can achieve. And that is an overwhelming feeling and it does not feel good. And it is reflective of the ways in which our society undervalues the arts, right? So know that you're not alone and you're not crazy if you are having that feeling. It can be tempting to fudge the numbers to make it work, right? To be like, okay, well, there's a big hole, so I'll just like throw some income up top and hope for the best. Avoid that temptation because it can put you in a bad situation for a number of reasons, right? If you fudge your budget, it means that you may end up making commitments on the basis of those fudge numbers that you can't keep, right? Where you say, well, I'm going to pay this money because it's in my budget to pay it. But if you don't have that income secured, that might mean broken promises to people. Right? Avoid fudging. Instead, be honest about the resources that you do have. And then everybody here is wildly creative. Do what you can to find ways to work creatively with what you have, right? So it's very valuable to list all the expenses of doing the thing the way you really want to do it, truly, if you could do it anyway. And then list all the income that you feel very confident of getting and just seeing how big is the gap between them. Maybe that gap is huge. Maybe that gap is actually smaller than you thought. Depending on the size of that gap, you can say, can I find more ways to bring in money? Can I find places to reduce expenses? Can I work out a compromise that feels realistic, right? Don't always make that bare minimum budget just because you are afraid of what it would look like if you asked for more or wanted to do more, right? Say what you want to do. Wish out loud. Advocate for the world you want. And then make the compromises based on the reality that you're facing, right? Don't be afraid to use your budget as a way to come up with a plan. Use your budget to actually play with different numbers before you finalize it. Try a few different ones until you find one that seems good. I really, really encourage you to experiment with your budget rather than just be like, these are the numbers, I'm done. Overall, it's really important to be both dreamy and imaginative and honest and realistic, right? A great budget is based on some amount of visionary thinking, some amount of saying, well, I want to do this and I believe I can do this. And if I got this money, here's what I would do. At the same time as not being too pie in the sky, right? Or too kind of Pollyanna about what might happen. And these are my last budget tips. And then I'm done with my part. Right? Wish out loud. I just said this. My friend Min is a Buto dancer in Berlin, and she says this a lot. Wishing out loud gives you the chance to actually hear what it is that you want. We don't often give ourselves permission to say what we actually want to do because the fear of disappointment is really high. Say what you want to do and then go from there. It might not mean that you actually can do it, but if you don't say it, you'll never know how close you are. It's good to end up with a budget that's conservative on the income side, right? You're careful about how much income you're saying you're going to have. And generous for expenses, right? Let things cost maybe a little bit more than you think they're going to, because that way you can be pleasantly surprised by success instead of setting goals that you can't actually reach. Again, be honest, don't fudge numbers. If you don't know how much something is going to cost, make an educated guess. Do some research. Say what seems likely and reasonable. If you don't get it exactly right, that's fine. Err on the side of caution. Again, budget notes, really important. Use them if you can. Build in a buffer for contingencies, right? So if you're sort of like, I've put a lot of things into this budget, am I missing something? Add a line in your budget that's just other, right? Other admin, other program, and just put a chunk of money in there where if something goes wrong, if something doesn't come through, if something costs more, you have basically a little safety zone, right? A chunk of money that's like padding between you and your problems, right? Make your budget a little bit bigger than it needs to be so that if something doesn't turn out the way you expected, you've got a tiny bit of safety net. If you're not sure of something in a budget template or guidelines and you're applying for a grant, always ask the funders. Funders want you to know how to do this because they want to say yes, right? They want to look at your budget and be like, great, this looks cool, let's do it. And finally, just remember that reality never perfectly matches a budget. It's not there to be a projection of actual reality. It's just there to help you navigate the road, right? Feel free to reach out and contact me anytime. Jericha at jerichasenyak.com. You're all in the arts affiliates, which means you get free coaching time with me. I am available in a resource. Please make use of me to whatever extent I can be helpful. I want to be. I support the work you do enormously. And I'm a huge, huge believer in the power of fiscal sponsorship to support work like yours. Thank you for attending my presentation. Please ask me any questions that you have, or go ahead and drop off. I'm happy to stay on a few more minutes before everybody else has to go. And throw them in.
I just wanted to ask if you're available next week and if it's just good to get that time on your radar now.
Shoot me an email. Shoot me an email right now. Yep, just go ahead and shoot me an email.
Can you drop your email in the chat?
Yes, I certainly can.
Thank you.
And I do have limited availability next week, but I do have some, and I can do some open office hours as well if there's multiple people messaging, and just be open for people to drop in and ask questions that you may have.
Is that a particular version of Excel, and do you have any tutorials you'd recommend? Because I suck at it.
I do a lot of just Googling how do you ... in Excel. That's kind of my way to go. If you have specific questions, happy to go over how I use budgets in Excel and like tips and tricks. Just make time with me and I will go through whatever details you want. You're like, how do you do this?
The Google Sheets forum is like very eager to share their information. So you can always, there's a lot of resources for that.
And you will get the template and the slides. Yeah, Una.
Okay. And sorry if this is a little bit too targeted, but I've been a multimedia artist and I'm working in like increasingly executive roles, director and all that. And I really would like to take all of these projects and bring it into an organization. I have a mission statement. I understand like how, in supporting other artists that I can, like further this mission that isn't just about, getting the funds to do my projects, but also to sort of build the kind of economy that I'd like to see here locally. But like, even as I like pitch to IAM for fiscal sponsorship for the org, as opposed to just the project, I can't tell how long my timeline should be as I'm thinking about, like, is that something that I should like think about getting organization grants in 2 years or in 6 months?
Well, this is a great question. And I'm happy to talk to you about kind of thinking about budgeting in that structure. This I would say is probably make some time with me outside of CAC, right? Because this is probably not dependent on CAC funding timeline, just given where you're at. So make some time with me and we can talk about this. And there's also strategic planning coaches that Indie Arts has, which might also be able to give you some thoughts about this as well. Right, because you get that use that free coaching time, right? One of the things that I think is wonderful about Indie Arts is that you get that free coaching time. So use that free coaching time. Feel free to reach out to me and I'm happy to talk to you about like thinking about budgeting for projects versus organization and kind of like what that might look like over a multi-year period.
Awesome. Thank you so much.
A pleasure.
It was really wonderful presentation.
So. Oh, good. I'm glad you liked it. Hope I always striving to be helpful. Ralph, do you still have I see you have your hand up.
Yeah, just a quick question. I'm coming to the end of a CAC grant, and pretty soon, I have to line up and justify all the expenses and stuff. If a certain category we end up spending less than what was expected, how common is it to give money back when it's over?
Very
Is that
rare,
something
very rare,
expected?
very rare. Yes, they they ask you to explain variances. Of a certain amount, like usually it's like 20
We're not talking about a lot,
20% or
just
more. Not, yeah, I mean, a small amount is certainly not a big deal. Usually you only have to give grant funds back if you really couldn't meet a specific need that was originally outlined, or if you significantly underspent, right? If you spent a little bit more over here and a little bit less over there, and like overall you netted, like, right, you had expenses in the eligible categories that added up, great, they're happy. Listen, funders don't want you to give grants back if they can possibly avoid it. It's miserable for them as well as being miserable for you. Some funders, especially government funders and especially city government funders, have very, very weird and stringent regulations around like what they can and can't do. And those are typically called conditional grants. And there's now some kind of like different ways of accounting for those to kind of prevent situations where you have to give funds back. It does happen and it's stressful for everybody and miserable. But if you're just like not exactly on point, again, the whole point is that the budget is a guideline. There is not an expectation that things are going to go exactly the way that you said that they were going to go, right? It's if something goes very, very differently, they're going to ask for an explanation. And in some cases, if it goes like really radically differently, or you couldn't do the program, right, or whatever it is, in that case, they might ask for those funds to be returned.
So I can spend a little more in one
Oh
category
yeah,
and a
absolutely.
little bit less in the other.
Absolutely, absolutely. Yes, yes, yes. Budgets are squishy.
Gotcha.
They're meant to be squishy. They're meant to be squishy. They are not trying to be draconian about this. At least CSC is not. A couple, certain government funders, San Francisco Arts Commission, some of their grants are really draconian. DCYF is a nightmare on this. There are a few others that are really draconian about the spending, but state and federal government grants, they don't have the resources to look at every detail.
Gotcha. Okay, thanks. That's all.
Great. Kelly, I feel like you had a question in the chat that I want to make sure we address. Do you want to drop that in now?
Oh yeah, I'm wondering because of the hybrid situation of having a live opening night on Halloween each year now, we've set that date and it works well for Chico weather. And the online will be, all weekend till Saturday midnight streaming. And we got like 260 films in 4 days from around the world.
Amazing.
So, well, I made it free, everybody. Okay. So especially if you're from the affiliate, apply. I don't care what level of film you think it is, I'm a seeder. So the hybrid seating and the Chico party weekend, it's still a live event now, which, I had even discrepancies with Film Freeway, big problem. They took me down marketing me because of the hybrid. So I'm coming back to life, but I'm remaining hybrid. Does that affect my grant?
I don't believe that it should. I don't think that CAC has requirements specifically related to hybrid, to online versus in person. Double check with Lisa if you're not sure, but I don't remember seeing anything that has anything to do with requirements one way or the other.
Because the sponsorships, dropped, and a lot of things dropped, which is fine because the new website's out, you guys. It's done. We got a new shop and everything.
That's great.
So, yeah, it's great. And American Indie, my other company, a real one, is launching, and it'll be a main sponsor, and that will be pulling in things that are unusually good for a little boutique festival that we are. But the online presence is going to grow, and the grant system, I guess I'll talk to you. Is that going to grow? Because it's not just CAC, it's going to grow into digital grants, correct?
Yeah, I mean, I don't know what grants are out there specifically for films or kind of for online or not online, right? Like it's always worth looking for things that are niche. Certainly, there is more support for online presence. I don't know how many grants are out there specifically for digital offerings, but it's worth looking into some. I'm probably not the person to talk to about grant opportunities since I'm not one of the fundraising folks. There are fundraising coaches within Indie Arts who are fabulous. Thor is one, Kyle is another. I'm the person to talk to about your numbers. But yeah, check out what's out there, Kelly, for sure.
Correct. And my grant writer, she's $3,500 a year. She's a campfire victim from Chico, and she worked for Video Maker magazine for 8 years, articles and everything, Nicole. Now, is there any kind of help for CAC to put her in the budget that I need that money to pay her each year?
So CAC won't cover fundraising costs. So if you have a grant writer who you're paying for grant writing, that isn't something that you can ask CAC to pay for. If other work for you, yes, and other funders are happy to pay for that, right? But that is not something that CAC will cover.
Well, that's my only hurdle at this point.
Got it.
That's a big chunk for some people, you know.
For sure. Yeah, absolutely.
Far north, you know.
Absolutely.
Far north.
Yeah, Kelly, I actually live just outside Mount Shasta, so I definitely know.
Okay, you're my people. So, you know, I'm in Henderson drying out from long COVID brain, and my mother's passing. So I'm there again. We have a brand new internship program, you guys, from Chico State. It's the Handshake. You can look up Handshake for all of you. And the volunteer internship. And if you qualify through any school or Indie Arts, it really is a professional pull-in of people that can help you.
How great, Kelly. Thank you so much for sharing. Really appreciate it. Amy or Ari or Neil or Mary Jean, do you have, I think you're our last folks left. Do you have any last questions that I haven't answered before we hop off for the day? Looks like no. Pleasure to have you all. Thank you all so much for your time. Amy, it looks like you unmuted.
Oh, I just wanted to say thank you.
My pleasure.
To listen to other people's questions.
Great.
I miss you, Jericha.
Miss you, Mary Jean. I hope I see you next time I'm in the city.
Yeah, and thank you for helping me tango through taxes.
Always a pleasure. All right, folks. Thank you so much for coming. Have a beautiful rest of your day and good luck with your grants. Bye, Neil. Good to see you.